Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuhu. I am Zulfa Ibrahim Abdul Rahman, the first reporter from Group 11. So the title of my report is Rashid Al-Ghanouchi, Portrait of a Contemporary Islamic Thinker and Activist, El-Fatih A. Abdel Salam. So the purpose of this chapter is to shed light on the thought of Rashid Al-Ghanouchi, the founder and a leader of Al-Nahda movement of Tunisia. The chapter begins with a biographical account of Ghanouchi's life concentrating on those factors that contributed to the development of his personality and political thinking. The biographical account represents the backdrop of the analysis of Ghanouchi's major ideas, which cover the following fields: secularism and modernism, democracy and its compatibility with Islam, civil society, human rights, civil liberties, Islam and the West, Islamic movements, and the fundamental principle of Islamic State. So, in its totality, this study is a perusal in modern Islamic political theory and adopts the analytical approach. So it derives its information mainly from secondary sources such as books, articles in magazines, interview with Ghanouchi, his public lecture, and other unpublished materials. A biographical account. Rashid Al-Ghanouchi was born on 22 June 1941 in a small village close to Al-Hamma in the province of Gabis near the southeastern coast of Tunisia during the turbulence and commotion of World War II. Tunisia at that time endured under the harsh French colonial overlordship. So Ghanouchi, the youngest of the 10 siblings of a peasant family, grew from infancy into childhood under these conditions. His father, who can recite the Quran by memory, was treated by the villagers as a mufti and imam. They would send their children to his house to receive instruction. It was under the tutoring of his father, the young Ghanouchi studied and memorized the Quran, as did his elder brothers before him. The traditional Muslim community of the village was characterized by peace, harmony, and compassion. There was no electricity and other features of modernity which usually characterize urban life. Financially, Ghanouchi's family was average. They were neither rich nor poor. As a youngster, he worked with his father in the field plowing and tiling, while continuing his primary education in a traditional Islamic madrasa. Ghanouchi was violently traumatized by the conflict between his religious education and the theology secularized society brought about by the French rule and its continuation under the national rule of President Habib Bourguiba. Ghanouchi's maternal uncle Al-Bashir had a great influence over his young nephew. Al-Bashir was an enthusiast of Pan-Arabism and its leader, Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Ghanouchi would listen as of political development during the tumultuous period. In addition to this early political education, as a child, Ghanouchi witnessed the emergence of the armed struggle against the French colonizer. The heavy-handed policy and ruthlessness of the colonizer imbued him with a deep sense of aberration towards colonialism. In addition, his early readings about the atrocities committed by Zionist terrorist gangs against Palestinians in the late 1940s deeply affected him. At the age of 18, Ghanouchi left the village for the capital, Tunis, to pursue his secondary school education at the prestigious Madrasat al-Zaytuna, where he obtained a degree in theology. Then he joined the Khaldounia Secondary School. The years Ghanouchi spent in Al-Zaytuna exposed him and made him more sensitive to the identity crisis which the French and after independence the Bourguiba government he created through the extensive secularization of Tunisia. In the name of modernization, Bourguiba sidelined Tunisia's Arab Islamic heritage, replacing it by the official and elite Francophile culture. So for Bourguiba, Islam represented the past and the West was Tunisia's only hope for a modern future. Ghannouchi summed this identity crisis as follows: I remember we used to feel like strangers in our own country. We had been educated as Muslim and Arabs, while we could see the country totally molded by the French culture. His Arabic education at Al Zaytuna naturally barred him from entering the French-speaking university at home. So in 1964, he went east to Damascus where he enrolled in the Faculty of Letters studying philosophy. His philosophical studies deeply influenced his thought and its impact was discernible in his writing and mode of thinking. As a student, he briefly joined a secular pan-Arab party, the Syrian Nationalist Social Party, which was influenced by Nasser. However, he soon became disenchanted with pan-Arabism, which he blamed for the Arab-crushing defeat in 1967. Despite the secular appeal of pan-Arabism, Ghannouchi commented, "In my inner self, I did not cease to be a believer." While in Syria, he contacted the Syrian Ikhwan, which made him become strongly attracted to the Muslim Brothers' Islamic ideology, which he subsequently adopted in its totality. He graduated in 1968 with a master's degree in philosophy and left for France to further his studies at the Sorbonne. There he witnessed the tumultuous student uprising, culminating in the resignation of French President Charles de Gaulle. To Ghannouchi, France's political upheaval discredited the supposed superiority of Western civilization. Unfortunately, his studies had to be cut short because of family difficulties, and he returned home in 1969. In Tunis, he took up a job as a philosophy teacher in a secondary school. There he came across a nascent Islamist movement, the most prominent members being Shawikh bin Milad, Ahmaida al-Naifar, and Abdel Fattah Mauro. The movement was inspired by the Indian-based Jama'at al-Tabligh. In time, this movement grew in size, drawing large numbers of followers to listen to popular preachers using the mosque as their platform. In 1970, Ghannouchi organized Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, the Islamic group, a clandestine group whose leader came mainly from the Tabligh group. Because of the government ban of such organization, Al-Jama'a remained underground, but its leaders utilized the platform of a government-sponsored society called the Society for the Preservation of the Holy Quran. Ghannouchi and his colleagues used the platform with the express desire to rebuild the Arab-Muslim character of Tunisia's society, drawing from the teaching of such Muslim revivalists as Abu al-Maududi, Hassan al-Banna, and Sayyid Qutb. However, as soon as the government found out about the activities of that cell, it expelled its member. This signaled the beginning of a long relation of animosity with the Bourguiba government. Ghannouchi used his position as a philosophy teacher in a secondary school to Islamize the philosophy curriculum, which to him reflected a bias of the materialistic Western philosophy as presented in Marxism, Freudianism, and Brownism, and existentialism. To him, the philosophy curriculum addressed primarily psychological and sociological issues of Western society and would not be suitable to address those problems which Islamic societies were facing. In his critical analysis, he presented Islam as an alternative to his young students throughout the 1970s. As Ghannouchi's young student went to university, his ideas began to strike root there. So, for most of the 1970s, Ghannouchi and some of the leading members of Al-Jama'a traveled to neighboring Algeria to attend the annual Islamic Thought seminars where the group members became attracted to the Islamic thought of Malik bin Abi. Benabi had a profound influence of Ghanouchi, who considered him as a pillar of Islamic thought and a revivalist of Ibn Khaldun's Islamic rationalism. In those seminars, members of the Tunisians group were given exclusive audience with Benabi, who lectured them on philosophical and political issues. Benabi empirically and scientifically approached reality and then would proceed to conduct a dialogue between such diagnosis of reality and the religious text. To Ghanouchi, Benabi's methodology was different from what had been accepted in Orthodox Islamic methodology, which envisioned reality as derived solely from the religious text. This experience had a profound impact of Ghanouchi, who came to conceive Islamic rationalism as a symbiosis of reason and revelation. In his preaching, he started to offer his audience an Islam that would encompass more than prayers and rituals. And he addressed their specific spiritual, economic, and political problems. He questioned the validity and relevance of the traditional methodology and instead asked what concerned the young people of today, and pondered over the position of the Mu'tazilites on the attributes of God. Whether the Quran is pre-existent or created, I wonder how our students feel studying Islamic philosophy when it offers them only a bunch of dead issues having nothing to do with problems of today. I propose that these shrouds be returned to their graves, that these false problems be buried, and that we deal with our real problems, economic, politics, and sexual license. This new outlook sensitized Ghanouchi to some of the major deficiencies in the traditional Islamic movement. The source of the deficiency lies within the traditional Islamic movement itself. Despite repeated attempts, this thought remains burdened by models from the age of decline. Its only connection to reality is through texts whose understanding became petrified, whose concept crystallized centuries ago under circumstances quite different from our time. He cites two examples of this debilitating issue: the working class and the role and position of women in society. The Islamists have failed to mobilize the working class, leaving the door wide open for the proponents of leftist and rightist ideologies to dominate the sector. So, the reason behind the failure goes back to the Islamist ignorance and insensitivity regarding the political and social problem of the working class. The Islamists must break from the traditional belief that Unionism was aligned to the Islamic view of life, which disapproves of class conflict and bears no pretense of absolute equality in material status. Likewise, Ghanouchi argued that the influence of the Islamists on the female sector has been restricted for the same reason: a lack of awareness and insensitivity toward the oppression, degradation, abasement, restriction of women's horizons and roles in the life of society that they have endured during the long centuries of decline. It was natural that women became influenced by the anti-Semites because they had been suffering under the yoke of an oppressive false Islam sustained by the silence of the men of religion. What the Muslim woman needs to do is a liberation movement to restore her to herself and to her innate nature as a guardian of the heritage of mankind and a partner of a man in the jihad to liberate herself and him from the forces of exploitation and submission except to God. So, this daring thought led Ghanouchi to bring his Islamist appeal into the Tunisians' working places. Through the Union General des Travailleurs Tunisians (UGTT), the General Union of Tunisian Workers. Many workers were drawn to Ghanouchi's message, and over the next few years, the Islamic movement became a major force into the UGTT, as more and more rural and urban workers openly sympathized with the Islamists. That was a daring move Ghannouchi and his movement in a class of their own during the period of 1970 to 78. The Islamic movement in Tunisia remained focused on religio-cultural transformation of society. However, in the late 70s, the movement had to focus more seriously on a political issue and reaction to the domestic situation in Tunisia and the events in Iran culminating in the Islamic Revolution there. The Islamists found themselves forced to rethink their ideas and strategy. It was an uphill task for Ghannouchi and his movement in addressing current issues: worker rights, jobs, wages, poverty, westernization versus a more authentic national and cultural identity, political participation presenting a living Islam rather than the museum Islam which Ghannouchi had encountered earlier. So the early 1980s was a watershed for the movement. In April 1981, Bourguiba announced a program of political liberalization, opening up his one-party political system. Ghannouchi and his associates responded by dissolving their movement, Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyah, and setting up a political party, the Islamic Tendency Trend Movement, Harakat al-Ittija al-Islami. Ghannouchi applied for license but they never received a response from the authorities. Undeterred, the ITM leadership publicly proclaimed the new organization as a political movement based on Islam. Ghannouchi called for the reconstruction of economic life on a more equitable basis, the end of single-party politics, and the acceptance of political pluralism and democracy. He advocated a resurrection of the Islamic way of life in his country, the renewal of Islamic thought, a return to more moral and religious values, and a limitation on westernization. In addition, he stressed the ITM's rejection of violence as a means of transforming society. At the time, Ghannouchi's espousal democracy was unacceptable to many Islamic groups outside Tunisia who interpreted it as an imitation of the West. So for the government and its ruling, the Styrian Socialist Party, Islamism was an anathema to their espousal of modernity and progress. By July 1981, the regime moved to round up Ghannouchi and all known leaders and members of the ITM and imprisoned them. Ghannouchi remained in prison from 1981 to 1984. While in prison, he memorized the Quran, studied some work on tafsir and fiqh, and completed the draft of his best-known book Al-Hurriyat Al-Amma fil Al-Dawla Al-Islamiyya, Public Liberties in the Islamic State, which was intended by Ghannouchi as a model of modern Islamic society. The bread riots of 1984 forced the government to create a climate of political appeasement. Bourguiba amnestized a number of political prisoners, including Ghannouchi. In response to the prison experience of 1981 to 84, ITM was restructured to function on two levels, one clandestine to other public. So the 1984 amnesty did not end the harassment of ITM. In March 1987, Ghannouchi was arrested and held incommunicado in solitary confinement for weeks. Bourguiba succeeded momentarily in slicing a troublesome foe, but the aging dictator undermined his regime's credibility and paved the way of his own removal. In November 1987, Prime Minister Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, in a bloodless coup, seized power from Bourguiba. Ben Ali moved quickly to legitimize his rule and counter the government's Islamic opposition, and therefore freed Ghannouchi and some of his associates. The initial period of new president indicated a movement to legitimate political pluralism. The authorities proclaimed a law in 1988 regulating the formation and function of political parties. However, the law banned political parties organized on ethnic, regional, racial, or confessional basis. The ITM seized on the opportunity and applied for license in December 1988 under the name of Hizb al-Nahda, the Renaissance Party. By the time of the vote of the legislative election of April 1989, al-Nahda had not received recognition, and most of the party supporters contested election as independents, emerging as the largest opposition force with impressive performance, particularly in urban centers. However, in June 1989, al-Nahda application for recognition was rejected. Two factors seem to have influenced the government decision: the impressive performance of Ghanouchi candidates in the national election, which highlight al-Nahda's political potential, and the victory of the Islamic Salvation Front (FIS) in the 1989 municipal election in Algeria. This sensitized Ben Ali, many Muslim rurals, to the danger posed by Islamists. Ben Ali's political liberalization program proved far from democratic, and his confrontation with al-Nahda escalated. In May 1989, Ghanouchi left Tunisia for Europe, where he has been living ever since in self-imposed exile in England. Most of his associates who escaped detention were forced underground or into exile. In his exile, Ghanouchi has been dedicating more of his energy to the cause of da'wah and writing than to political activism. So that's all. Thank you for watching.